Okay, so let's start off with the first question here. Okay, yeah, I'll be talking about a little bit more on phase transitions later on. So I'm just giving you the examples as such for now. So identify which of the following second order is a second order phase transition. Okay, so basically first order phase transitions are to deal with state change. Okay, so it's like from liquid to water, water to gas, all those kinds of things. Now, when you're looking at your second order phase transitions, it's to do a little bit with the properties of the material, like whether it's going to be a superconductor or whether it's going to become a superfluid, etc. Okay, so the transition of liquid helium-1 into liquid helium-2, transition of water into water vapor, transition of non-ferromagnetic state to ferromagnetic state. So out of these, you need to like pick up a couple of options. So they've given you these 4 options here. Okay, so here you have 1 and 2. Okay, so you know that it's not, this one is a first order phase transition, so any option with 2 should be neglected. Okay, so I will show you a couple of second order phase transitions here. So you'll kind of like realize it's this transition of liquid helium-1 into liquid helium-2 and transition of non-ferromagnetic state to a ferromagnetic state. Okay, so it's option C, that's the answer. Let's look at some of the examples here. So in the examples which you see is, the first one is a ferromagnetic transition. So that's what the last option kind of like tells you about, transition of non-ferromagnetic state to the ferromagnetic state. Then what you have is, just a second. Okay. Then what you have is ferromagnetic okay, let me move on to this point. The superconducting transition, just a minute, something is wrong here. Okay. So the next one is a superconducting transition. Okay, so for type 1 superconductors, the phase transition is second order at 0 external field. Okay, for type 2 superconductors, the phase transition is second order for both normal state and mixed state together, or mixed state and superconducting state transitions. So what I will do is, for now, I'm just giving you the examples as such. There are many more questions that are coming up, so I'll be discussing second order phase transitions a little more on detail later. Now, the other one is a superfluid transition. So in your superfluid transition, what you basically see is this helium-1, helium-2 kind of a transition, which was the first point that was mentioned in this question. So the transition of liquid helium-1 into liquid helium-2. Okay, so now let's move on to the next question. The Ising model is used to understand the behavior of a substance whose molecules possess what? Non-magnetic nature, random orientation, electrostatic nature, magnetic moment. Okay, so these, what your electron is basically, it's a tiny magnet. Okay, so let's look at the electron as a tiny magnet. Now here, what they say is that ferromagnetism arises when a collection of atomic spins align. Okay, so there's alignment. I will be discussing today a little more on ferromagnetism, so it's going to be okay for you. So magnetism arises when a collection of atomic spins aligns such that their associated magnetic moments all point in the same direction. Okay, so ferromagnetism is basically when you're supposed to be relating ferromagnetism to a real magnet. Okay, so once you place this ferromagnetic material into a magnetic field, it is going to become a magnet. So how do you make it not a magnet? You have to heat it up later on. There are different other techniques that you can use to make it non-magnetic later on. But this ferromagnetism has this particular property that you take this material, which is ferromagnetic, which is not a magnet, and you put it into a magnetic field and take it out of the field, it becomes a magnet. So I will be discussing this a little more on detail today. Okay. Now, the simplest theoretical description of ferromagnetism is called the Ising model. I cannot describe Ising model entirely. Okay. So I will tell you that Ising model is related to how you can understand ferromagnetism. Okay. So let's move on to the next question. Okay. So this is something that you will need for your second semester. So I'm going to be discussing a little bit more detailed on this, not just for KSET, but also for your MSc paper. So let's look at this. Fractional fluctuations of number of particles in Bose-Einstein gas is given by. Okay, so these are the different options that you have. And this Ni tilde basically refers to the average number of particles. Okay, so you want to find out the fractional fluctuations. And if you've looked at Reeve properly for your second semester thermodynamics, you would have seen a section called dispersion. Okay, so dispersion is basically your fluctuation. Okay, so let's understand fluctuation in a basic way. Any kind of fluctuation, not just fluctuations in the number of particles, but fluctuations for any kind of a quantity, say x. So the deviation delta x of a quantity x from its average value x bar is given by this. So how do you define it? So the deviation delta x is basically the change. Okay, so this is the first quantity, the quantity that you have, and you take the average of those set of quantities and you subtract it and you get the deviation. So this is pretty simple to understand. Next, what you should note that is that if you have taken, let's say, an average value itself, it's going to end up becoming 0. Okay. So now let's look at the mean square deviation of a rough measure. Okay. First rough measure of the fluctuation. Okay. So what is that going to be? You're going to take your delta square and you're going to square it up. And then you want to find out the average. Okay. So what do you have here? You have an x minus x bar whole squared average, which is equal to x squared bar. Okay, so what you find out here is this is going to be x squared minus 2x x bar. Okay, so let me just write that down for you. So you have x minus x bar whole squared, which is equal to, and you have an average on top. Okay, so now I'm just going to leave that bar on top. So now you have an x squared minus 2x x bar plus x bar squared. Now, when you take the average throughout this whole thing, what do you end up getting? You have an x squared and a bar on top minus 2x bar. When you take the average of an average, it's going to be an average. So x bar is the same. Plus, you have an x bar squared here. Okay, so when you take the average of that too, it's going to end up being the same. So now what do you have? You have this as 2x bar squared and you have an x squared bar. Okay, so remember that this is on top of, it's like the average of your x squared. So what do you end up getting? After you simplify this section, you end up getting x bar squared, and here you have an x squared bar. Okay, so this is pretty much really easy to understand. Now let's look at the mean number of particles in a state S. So if you're looking at the mean number of particles in a state S, this is the way you would write it. Okay, so I think you should have done a derivation on this. Okay, to calculate the mean number of particles in a state S. I will refer the page number and tell you what it is. So you should probably go check that out because this is probably going to be coming for your MSc examination. So that's why I just thought I'll just go through this derivation quickly. So summation of R ns e to the power of minus beta n1 epsilon 1. So what do you have here? You take any quantity, say x, and multiply it with that probability, right? So that's what you're doing here. And this, I think you should be familiar with this by now. So you have a minus beta dou by dou epsilon s. You're taking a particular epsilon s, okay? The state s, which has the energy epsilon s. And you're taking the derivative with respect to that. This is your partition function, so you end up getting a 1 by z. And this would be, let's say the formula for the energy would be very familiar with you, this might not be very familiar, you may not be able to recall it from memory. So if you have an energy, you basically get a ln z somewhere in that term. Okay, so now let's just look into the average number of particles. So you have an ns bar is equal to -1 divided by beta. Z is the partition function, dou z divided by dou epsilon s. So this is something that you should keep in mind, because if you get the partition function and they ask you to find the average number of particles or the mean number of particles, you can calculate it easily, just like that, if you remember this formula. So note this formula in mind. Okay, so yeah, okay, so finally what do? You kind of like realize that this gives you a ln z. Okay, so this part that you have here, this term here, dou z by z can be written as dou of ln z. Okay, so that's what you have, a dou ln z divided by dou epsilon s. Now let's move to the next part. Okay, so now what do you need to do? The question said calculate the fluctuations or dispersion in the number of particles. So you need to be able to calculate that dispersion in the number of particles, not just any variable x. So that's why you have an ns here. So you have delta ns whole squared and an average, which is equal to ns minus ns bar whole squared and an average of that, which should yield you this. Compare it with the x thing that I've done earlier, okay, about 2 slides ago. Now you need to calculate ns squared bar. Okay, so now how do you do that? This is the basic definition of anything. So what you do is basically, let's say you want to find out the mean value of some kind of a variable x. What do you do then? You take that x bar, okay, and you multiply it with your p of, let's say, some r, and then you have to divide it by that p of r, and you need to sum it all over. Okay, so you would sum it over here and you would sum it over here. That's exactly what you're doing here. Okay, so that's why you have an ns square. If you compare it with the earlier one, which we did, let's just go back. I can show you that. Okay, so if you compare it with this here, you find that this is an ns. Whereas if we compare it with the next one, you find that it is an n squared. This is a basic definition that you have. So now how do you calculate the partition function? How do you calculate the average number of the square of the particles? Average number of the square of the particles. Okay, so not just the average number of particles, but the average number of the square. And why do you need that? Because you have this over here. You need to calculate the value over here. So now you multiply this and you get this value. Okay, this is pretty trivial. You should be able to do this by now. And if you don't get it, get back to me on it. Okay, try working this out. If you're not able to get it, let me know, because I think I've kind of like gone in a very elaborate way and gone step by step. Okay, so after that, you substitute the value of ns in the earlier formula, substitute the value of ns squared after converting your ns squared average in terms of ns average. Okay, that's very important to note. You need to convert ns squared average. Just a second. Yeah. Okay, so ns squared average, you need to convert this into ns bar. Okay, and basically here you would realize that you get an ns bar squared. Okay, so finally, after doing all that calculation and subtraction and all that, you end up getting a formula like this. What is this? This is basically the dispersion that you have. Okay, delta ns whole squared is equal to 1 divided by beta squared dou squared ln z divided by dou epsilon s squared, which is pretty similar to the ns formula. Okay, so let's look at this. This is your ns formula. This is your dispersion formula. Okay, so what you have is this negative sign went away. You end up getting a 1 divided by beta squared. Here you have a dou squared ln z divided by dou epsilon s squared. So if you remember this, you just have to remember it's not exactly the square, okay? But it can help you remember the format of this, okay? Not exactly the square, because if you try and do this square, it's not the same as this, okay? So don't look at that way, but look at it in a very, like very pictographic way that you can, okay, if you find this, you can say that this is the square of this, except that you have to put it on top of the dough and all that. Okay, so now what you have got is you have got the dispersion, or what can you call it? You can call it fluctuation. Okay, that's what you've got here. So you've got the dispersion of fluctuation. So now what you do, you kind of like have to move on, and you need to calculate it specifically for Bose-Einstein statistics. Okay, specifically for Bose-Einstein statistics, and this you might have derived too. So your NS bar is equal to 1 divided by e to the power of alpha plus beta epsilon s minus 1. Okay, so this is something that you might have derived, and you should remember all the Bose-Einstein, Fermi-Dirac, and Maxwell-Boltzmann NS values, the average number of particles. Okay, so now what do? You take that NS value and you substitute it back into this formula. Okay, so this is your NS value, and you need to substitute it back into the formula. And let's look at this. Okay, so what did we do earlier? We found this out as 1 by beta dou NS bar by dou epsilon s. So you substitute the value of NS here, okay? And then you calculate it. And now what assumption you're supposed to do is this term here, dou alpha divided by dou epsilon s, is very negligible. Okay, it's very, very small. It's approximately 0. So you can ignore that term out. And then finally what you end up with is the dispersion in terms of NS bar and this. Okay, so you can take this out and you can write NS bar 1 plus NS bar. Okay, so you're getting the dispersion in terms of the average number of particles. So let's just go back to the question. Okay. So now here, what have they asked for? They've asked for the fractional fluctuations, not just any fluctuations. They've asked for the fractional fluctuations of the number of particles of Bose-Einstein gas, of the number of particles in the Bose-Einstein gas. Okay. Now let's go back here. Okay. So you've kind of like figured that this is the formula, but you need to be able to divide it by your NS bar squared in order to calculate the fractional fluctuation. So what you do, you take this dispersion of fluctuations in BE stat, and then you divide it by NS bar squared. So once you divide it by NS bar squared, you end up getting this kind of a format, 1 by NS bar plus 1. So I've done it with S. You can take the I value and you can do it. Okay, so here what you end up getting is option C. You have 1 plus 1 divided by Ni. Now, typically what people would do is mug up the formulas for your fractional fluctuations, and you end up ticking this answer out because you do not have time to do all this thing out. Or you need to remember this. You need to remember this formula. Okay, your NS bar is equal to minus 1 divided by beta. Okay, and dou ln z divided by dou epsilon s. Using that, you can kind of like calculate your average dispersion or fluctuation. So using that, you do that and you divide it by this. So this is like probably to remind you about the 7 steps that are used. I don't think they would have derived this in your MSc course. They would have just said, okay, fine, let's just by heart these values for certain values of mean. You would end up getting pressure, mean work done, all those kinds of things. So into that, just write down the dispersion formulas of each of these things. Like, it's not just that you have dispersion for the number of particles. You can have, let's say, something like this. You can have delta ES divided by ES bar squared average. So you could have this for not just number of particles, but you can have it for energy. You can have it for any other kind of a property of the system. Okay, so let's just move on to that. That did take a long time, but let's just look at this. Okay, so the magnetic susceptibility per electron of diamagnetic materials is, okay, so you will be going to derive this formula this semester for your 3rd semester. You will be deriving this formula, and what you will see is that if you have a diamagnetic material, the magnetic susceptibility is always negative. So I'm not going to go into the derivation, but I'm just giving you the hint. If you have a diamagnetic material, the magnetic susceptibility is always going to be negative. Okay. So out of these options, which one has a negative sign? So you kind of like see that this is the one with the negative sign. You end up taking this option up. Okay. So let's look at why it is negative and why is it positive. Okay. And for what it is negative and what it is positive. Now, if the magnetic susceptibility is positive, then you call that material as a paramagnetic material. Now, here what happens is if you place the paramagnetic material, let's say in a magnetic field, okay, so let's put up a magnetic field here. And if you take let's say a material, okay, so let's take this paramagnetic material and put it inside this magnetic field, what is going to happen? The material is strengthened by the induced magnetization. Okay, so there's going to be an induced magnetization here. So it's going to align along that direction of the magnetic field. But in the case of, let's say, your diamagnetic material, when it is placed in the magnetic field, okay, so this guys is going to be strengthened. That means its internal field is along the same direction as the external magnetic field. Whereas in the case of your diamagnetic, what's going to happen is it is going to repel that magnetic field. Okay, so there are very nice consequences to this, which I will show you in a couple of more slides later. Okay, so let's look at this. Again, the Curie-Weiss law is something that you're going to be learning in your third semester towards the end of the course. So I don't want to go into the depth of the derivation, but I will tell you what the Curie-Weiss law basically does. So here you have your susceptibility given in terms of these different several things. Okay, so now let's look at this. At temperatures above the Curie temperature, so what you will see is, I think you might have kind of like seen this kind of a diagram in your BSc. Okay, so what you have here is, let's say, a critical temperature called the Curie temperature Tc, and you would have your susceptibility here. So this curve would be coming off like this. Okay, and you would have, let's say, some temperature theta or whatever. Now, at temperatures above this Curie temperature, the magnetic susceptibility for ferromagnetic materials. So one thing that you have to remember is that your Curie-Weiss law is only for ferromagnetic materials. Okay, it's only for ferromagnetic materials. So now what do you have? Let's take this magnetic susceptibility. What does it say? It says it's inversely proportional to the difference in temperature here. Okay, so your chi is proportional to, if this can be, this is usually denoted as T in some textbooks denoted as theta. So I'm kind of like giving you that so that you don't get confused. I'm kind of like telling you what it's basically saying. Okay, it's just the same. Theta and T is the same. Yeah, just a second. Okay, so yeah, so this Tc and theta is the same. Okay, so here you have 1 divided by T minus Tc. Tc, which is your Curie temperature, can also be denoted as theta. So now what do you have? If it is above the Curie temperature, that means, let's say, if it's somewhere here, okay, then it is proportional to 1 divided by T minus Tc. So here C is basically your Curie constant, which is specific to the material, and T is the absolute temperature. Tc is your Curie temperature, and both have to be measured in the same unit. So you have to be careful about that. You can't measure one in degree C and one in degree Kelvin. The thing about this is there's a hiccup over here. What is that? So basically what happens when your T is equal to Tc? Your Xi is proportional to 1 to y 0. This goes to a non-defined value. So that's the main hiccup over here. Okay, in your Curie-Weiss law, you will kind of like find different laws that are there to describe about the ferromagnetic materials properties. So you will go on depth to learn about that in your third sem. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Okay, so yeah, So this I kind of like did because there's a question that's coming up next, and they kind of like gave all the options: paramagnetic, ferromagnetic, diamagnetic, all that. So I think that even though we learned this all in BSc, there is a tendency to forget this. Okay, so I'm trying to like kind of like give you some kind of a visual aid in order to remember this properly. So what is paramagnetism? Paramagnetism is due to one or more unpaired electrons. So in paramagnetic substances, they are weakly attracted in the presence of the magnetic field, which I showed you earlier. I kind of like drew those magnetic fields and placing those materials inside it and what happens. So in the absence of your magnetic field, the magnetism is removed. Now in your diamagnetic materials, they are weakly repelled by the magnetic field. So these substances have electrons that are paired. Okay, all the electrons are paired and there are no unpaired electrons. Now, what about your ferromagnetic material? Ferromagnetic material is basically magnets. Okay, so the first thing that you should think about is magnets. Substances that possess very strong attraction in the presence of your magnetic field are called ferromagnetic. In addition to strong attraction, these substances become permanently magnetic. Okay, so if you take this substance and you place it in a magnetic field, it's going to come out as a magnet. Okay, so these kind of materials, you will see that it's kind of like, if you have some kind of a material like this, you're going to be seeing that it's kind of split into particular domains. Okay, so metal ions of ferromagnetic substances are arranged as domains in a small area, a collective group. Each domain acts as a small magnet. Okay, so what you have here, like I told you before, your electron can be pictured as a small magnet. What happens here, all these electrons kind of like club together, and then you end up getting a particular strong field over there. Okay, it becomes a domain. Now, in non-magnetic piece of ferromagnetic substance, these domains are aligned randomly and their magnetic moments get cancelled. When you take the same randomly arranged domains and you place it in a magnetic field, all the domains are oriented in the direction of the magnetic field. So if the magnet is now removed, the alignment of the domain is maintained and the ferromagnetic substance becomes a permanent magnet. Okay. Now let's go on to understanding this. Okay. So how do you do that? Okay. So what happens is, this is your ferromagnet. Okay. What you do now is you take this ferromagnet and you place it onto a magnetic field. What you kind of realize is that all these arrows are pointed in the direction of the magnetic field. Okay, so let's say the magnetic field is this direction. All of them is pointed in the direction of the magnetic field. Not just that. Okay, so if you look at the number of domains that are here, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And look at the number of domains that are here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are 8 domains here and there are 12 domains here. So the number of domains that are over here in this region, okay, it's becoming lesser. Okay, when you once you place it in the magnetic field, so the size of the domain increases and the number of domains become lesser. Okay, so the difference is in the size and the number of domains in the two cases. Okay, so here you do not have a magnetic field. Okay, once you take this guy and you place it into a magnetic field, this is what happens: the size of the domain becomes bigger, the number of domains reduces. Okay, so that's your ferromagnetic material. Antiferromagnetic material. Okay, so the formation of their domains is similar to the ferromagnetic substance, but the domains are oriented in the opposite direction. Okay, so the magnetic moments get cancelled out. Okay, and what you have is these antiferromagnetic material. Okay, so if you take them and you let's say you put it above a critical temperature called your Néel temperature, which also you will be learning now in your third semester condensed matter physics course, general paper. Okay, so you'll be learning that as well. If it is above this critical temperature called the Néel temperature, what is going to happen is it's going to become a paramagnetic material. So how do you take this ferromagnetic material and make it a paramagnetic material? You put it above the Néel temperature and you end up getting a paramagnetic material. Okay, so what you see is these are all equal. Okay, so the vectors that you see here, okay, they are all equal. Okay, so they get cancelled out here in your antiferromagnetic material. Okay, So let's look at a comparison between this. Ferromagnetic, I think I kind of like told you, it's like highly aligned, okay? Antiferromagnetic, again, I kind of like told you, look at the size of the vector here. That's why I want to like specify on it, because the next part contains a little bit of different sizes here, okay? So your antiferromagnetic material, below your Tn, the spins are aligned anti-parallel in your magnetic domains, okay? Now, how do you get your antiferromagnetic material to become a paramagnetic material? You bring it above your Tn value, okay, and you get this as a paramagnetic material. But if it is below your Néel temperature, it is always going to be an antiferromagnetic material. If it is above the Néel temperature, it becomes a paramagnetic material. Now, let's look at the ferrimagnetic material. So, below your critical temperature, okay, or the Curie temperature, the spins are aligned anti-parallel, okay, but they do not cancel out. So there is going to be some kind of a net direction here like this, okay? So that kind of a material is called a ferrimagnetic material. It's usually seen in ionic solids, okay? So let's look at this. When the magnetic moments of the domains are arranged in parallel or anti-parallel to each other, but the length of the vector is unequal, okay? So here you should look at these vectors. What do they depict? They basically depict your magnetic moment. So there's going to be a net magnetic moment in some particular direction. Okay, so that's your ferromagnetic material. Now, why I discussed all of this is because I want to do this question. Okay, so all materials have dash property: paramagnetic, diamagnetic, ferromagnetic, or ferrimagnetic. Now, what you should realize is all the materials in the world, okay, have electrons, okay, electrons around their orbits, and most of them are paired electrons, okay? So what did we look at when we talked about your diamagnetic material? Are weakly repelled by the magnetic fields. These substances have all paired electrons. So that means you are a diamagnetic material. I am a diamagnetic material. Everything in the world is a diamagnetic material because it has some kind of paired electrons to it. Okay. So let's look at this. Okay, so all the materials have dash property. Okay, so like I told you before, every material in the universe has paired electrons in its orbit. Okay, so it's going to be always showing some kind of a diamagnetic property. So there have been experiments that have been conducted on things like this. Okay, so I think I should show you this picture before I move on to, yeah, okay. So there have been experiments that are conducted. So basically what they do is they take a frog and they place it in a magnetic field and it kind of like levitates on that magnetic field. Okay, so they haven't tried this out with humans, but even if you do it with humans, it should work. Okay, so if you can apply a strong enough electromagnetic field, you should start to levitate. Okay, so this is a levitating diamagnetic frog. So let's look at this question closely once more. All the materials have dash property. All the materials have some amount of diamagnetism in them. Okay. So let's look at this. So diamagnetism is a property of all materials and always makes a weak contribution to the material's response to a magnetic field. So the electrons in a diamagnetic material are all paired up. So this is an important point. All paired up, which spins anti-parallel so that there is no net magnetic moment on their atoms. When an external magnetic field is applied, the orbits of the electrons change, resulting in a net magnetic moment in the direction opposite to the applied magnetic field. So it should be noted that all materials have diamagnetism since all materials have orbiting electrons. Okay. But for your diamagnetic material, the spin of the electron does not contribute to the magnetism. Okay, but for your paramagnetic and ferromagnetic materials, the effects of the dipole moments that result from the spinning of the electrons are much greater than your diamagnetic effect. Okay, so like I told you earlier, this is the levitating frog. If you put your frog in a magnetic field, it's going to levitate on top of it. If you put a human being on top of it, in your magnetic field, it's going to levitate because all materials are diamagnetic. What about the other cases? There are spins involved in the other cases. In case of your diamagnetic, spins are not involved. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So this question is basically to do with linear regression. Okay, and I think some of it you would have learned in your experimental physics course in the second semester. I'm not sure if it was taught by a good person to you, but some of it, if you had referred Taylor, a book called Taylor, by Taylor, you would have kind of like done all this linear fitting and all that. Okay, not just that, you would have been asked to fit your data in your, let's say in the laboratory, or when you're doing the experiment, they would have asked you to, if you get a linear line, or if you're supposed to be getting a linear line, they would have asked you to do a linear regression or a linear fit and show you the result for it. So you'd end up getting the slope and the value of your intercept in the graph. So let's look at this. The equation of fitting a straight line that gives a naught equal to a1 x bar is equal to y bar. So this is basically the same as y is equal to mx plus c. Okay. Now here, what you're supposed to be noting is that y and x are averages. Okay. And your m is your a naught, and let's say c is your a1. Now, what you should remember is these are some technical points that I'm going to be telling you. Okay, so let's say you have some data points like, let's say x, these are the data points that you have. Okay, so you have 4 and 5, 3 and 2, 6 and 1. Okay, so just a second. Okay, so you have these data points with you. Now what do? You take these data points and you take the average of them. So you take x bar and you get some kind of an average value. You take y bar and you get some kind of an average value. Now this is called the centroid of your scatter plot. Okay, so these points are going to be here, 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 everywhere. Okay, once you plot them in your x and y axis, and you're going to, they're basically called scatter plots. Okay, when you don't draw a line between them. So x bar and y bar is the centroid of the given data points or your scatter plot. Okay, that's the first statement. The next statement is the fitted straight line passes through the centroid of the data points. So let's look at this. Okay, A and B are correct. Okay, that's what these are the options that are given to you. The two statements are given to you and these options are given to you. Only A is correct, only B is correct. Both A and B are wrong. Okay, so you need to check out what the centroid actually means. Okay, and you can find it by just the way they've written it down. So your x bar is basically x average values, y bar is y average values. The next thing that you've asked is, does the centroid pass through basically the straight line that you've fitted? Okay, so now, like I said, the centroid is an important point in your scatter plot. The centroid of a scatter plot is the average of your x values and the average of your y values. This is how it's denoted. Now, this is how you call your centroid. The most representative point within the group is called the centroid. Okay, so it's an extremely important point. Why do they call it the most representative point? It's because it's the average value. Okay, so now basically let's look at this part. The linear line, the regression line, is sometimes called the line of best fit or the best fit line. Okay, since it's best fit the data, it makes sense. Okay, so what it means is since it best fits all the data, okay, so it's giving you a best fit to the data, it makes sense that the line passes through the means. Okay, it should pass through the means. So the point x bar and y bar is called your centroid. So point A is true, your statement A is true, x bar and y bar is your centroid. Statement B is true as well because the centroid actually passes through the line of best fit. So you should probably try this out with let's say with your experimental data. They might ask you to do, once you start doing your experiments, you might ask you to kind of like plot the line of best fit, okay, on your graph itself. So after you do your linear regression procedure, and after that what you should do is you should take the average of those data that you got after you conducted the experiment, x and y values average, and then try plotting it. And you'll realize that that point called the centroid, which you've just plotted, lies on that best fit line. Okay, so now let's go to a little bit of electronics. Might have forgotten. Okay, so what I will do is just give you a basic hints on how it's done, and then, like I said earlier, I will probably like take 1 hour and probably just do a bit of electronics itself. So now, what is your ADC? ADC is basically analog to digital converter. Okay, flash ADC is basically, let's look at it slowly. Okay, so flash ADC is the slowest type of all ADCs. The converter which uses n comparators for generating an n-bit digital number. Fastest of all ADCs need 2 power n minus 1 comparators for generating an n-bit digital number. Cannot be practically realized. So what you should realize is there's something that's something called flash ADC that you've obviously learned in your first semester. Flash, the name itself tells you that it should be the fastest of all analog to digital converters. So basically it's the fastest of all analog to digital converters, and this might be a little technical, 2 power n minus 1 comparators for generating an n-bit digital number. So let's just look at how we can describe, how we can look at this flash ADCs, and then I will look at a 3-bit generating value. I mean a 3-bit generating ADC. Okay, analog to digital converter. So it consists of a set of high-speed comparators. So what is a comparator? It's basically a device that compares your input and reference voltages. Okay, so basically it's going to say on or give the output as 0 if it is less than, or give the output as 1 if it's greater than the reference voltage. So there are 3 or 4 components to your ADC. The first component is your high-speed comparators. That's point number 1. The next one is your resistor voltage divider circuit. The other one is an encoder. Okay. So if you look at an n-bit flash ADC, it consists of totally 2 power n minus 1 comparators with 2 power n matched resistors. Okay, so this is your comparator section. Okay, and these are the number of resistors. There's supposed to be another resistor here. Okay, there would be another resistor here. So that's how you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 matched resistors. Okay, how many comparators do you have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 comparators. That is basically 2 power n minus 1. How many digits am I going to get here? It's a 3-bit binary output. Okay, 1, 2, 3. There are 3 bits here. Okay, so 2 power 3 minus 1, which is going to be 8 minus 1, and it's going to be giving me 7. So 7 comparators and 2 power n matched resistors. So that's going to give me 8. So this is for a 3-bit. Okay, so if you know how to do it for a 3-bit, you can easily generalize it for n number of bits. Okay, so this is something that I would just tell you to keep it in memory instead of going through all the process of like how this basically works. Is it would basically look at the reference voltage. This is all your VREF, right? It's all, if you look at this part, it's all connected. All the negative terminals here are connected to your reference voltage, and this is your input voltage. Okay, so that's how it's going to compare the values with your V in and your VREF. Okay, so now let's move on to this next part. Okay, so this is again another electronic question. It's the formula is basically simple, but slew rate is something that most people don't look into. Okay, so an op-amp datasheet gives a 15-volt power bandwidth of 25 kilohertz. The slew rate is, okay, so you need to calculate the slew rate. Now let's look at this itself. Okay, so here you have voltage and you have microseconds here. Okay, so you know that you're supposed to be converting your frequency into, let's say, time. Okay, so what do you can just do it with dimensional analysis. Okay, here. So here, let's look at this. What is this basically giving you? It's giving you in hertz, so you could take the inverse of it and it should probably give you the time. So it should be your power, your 15 volt, your voltage 15 volt divided by your bandwidth. It should be something like that. Okay. So, but there would be a couple of other factors also coming in. Okay. So the output of an operational amplifier can only change by a certain amount in a given time. Okay. This limit is called your slew rate of the op-amp. And although the slew rate is not always mentioned, it can be a critical factor in ensuring that the amplifier is able to provide an output that is faithful with respect to the input. So if the input is something like this, let's say, I want an output that is kind of like this. Okay. What am I doing with an amplifier? I'm just amplifying the whole thing, right? So I want an output that is compared like this, right? I don't want an output which is like that. I don't want that lag there. Okay. It should somehow be a faithful representation of the input. Okay. So the slew rate of an op-amp or any amplifier circuit is the rate of change in the output voltage caused by a step change in the input. Now it is measured by voltage change in a given time. Okay. It's usually in volts per microseconds or in volts per milliseconds. Now, a typical general purpose device might have a slew rate. This is the average slew rate that is there. So that's around 10 volts per microseconds. Okay. So it should be around that for an average device, for a general purpose device. Now, this means that when a large step change is placed on the input, the electronic device would be able to provide an output of 10 volt change in 1 microsecond. So let's say you've put in some certain voltage, okay? And what your slew rate basically means is that I can provide a 10 volt change in 1 microsecond, okay? So if I put in 20 volts, it would take me 2 microseconds to produce that amount of change in the output. Okay. So that's what it's basically telling you when you look at the slew rate. Now, this is a square input wave. So you kind of like see that it's a little bit distorted. The output is a little bit distorted because the basic idea is that the slew rate kind of like causes this distortion. Okay. So if your slew rate is narrower and narrower, okay, you can't say narrower, if it's smaller, you're going to get this perfect square wave output. Okay, but if you have a bigger slew rate, then it's going to be distorted even more. Okay, so if your slew rate is bigger, it's going to be something like this, maybe like that. Okay, so now let's move on to this. Now, this is how your slew rate is written as. So you have a 2 pi f v. Okay, that is your slew rate, and what you kind of end up getting here is 2 pi into this, okay, into 15. You can just multiply those two values. So let me just go back to the question and show you what the values are. Yeah. Okay, so you've got a 15 volt, 15 volt change in your input, and you've got your bandwidth as 25 kilohertz. So you just substituted in your 2 pi v f, okay, 2 pi vf, and then you end up getting this value. So that's 2.356 volts per second. So that you kind of like realize is your option B here, 2.36 here. Okay. So just have to remember the formula is 2 pi f v. There's, I mean, like it's pretty easy to remember. Okay. So now let's look at this question. A piece of semiconducting material is introduced in a circuit. If the temperature of the material is raised in the circuit, the current will, what will happen to the current? Will the current increase, remain the same, decrease, or cease to flow? Okay. So let me just look into this concept a little more clearer. We're talking about a semiconductor being introduced into a circuit, right? So let's say some kind of a circuit which measures the current and all those kind of things. Okay. So you're talking about a semiconductor, not just any conductor, a semiconductor that's being introduced into a circuit. Now, with the rise in temperature, the resistance of the semiconductor decreases. And I will show you why that is. Okay. So this is the formula for conductivity for a semiconductor. Sigma is equal to Ne squared tau by M. The electron density increases as your electrons move from the valence band to the conduction band. So let me just show you the picture here. Okay, so if you basically look at this, okay, you're saying that the temperature is increasing. What's going to happen when the temperature increases? All the electrons in your valence band, it moves on to the conduction band. Not all, some of the electrons based on the temperature that you put in. So this is the energy of the electrons. It gets excited, it starts getting some amount of energy and starts moving on to the conduction band. Okay. So what happens when that is occurring? So what's your key idea here is the concentration of electrons. Let me just write concentration. Concentration of electrons, which is basically denoted as N, starts to increase. Okay, so the concentration of electrons in this conduction band here starts to increase. So now what you do is, let's look back here. So the formula for conductivity is given by what? Sigma is equal to Ne squared tau by M. So that means as your N increases, your conductivity would start to increase. And that means your rho, which is the inverse of your conductivity, your resistivity, would start to decrease. Okay, so with the rise in temperature, the resistance of the semiconductor decreases. That is one idea. Now, the conductivity increases and hence your resistivity decreases. Now, the overall resistance of the circuit decreases. So, if the resistance of the circuit decreases, automatically the current in your circuit would increase, right? Because why? Because V is equal to IR. So, you end up getting I is proportional to the inverse of the resistance. So, your current would increase with the decrease in resistance. Okay, so let's look at this. Now, this I want to kind of like give it to you as a homework, because in your 2013 paper, I kind of did the Fourier transform for a square wave. It should have been symmetric square wave, but they just mentioned it as square wave. Okay, so what I'd be telling you here is, okay, so the Fourier transform of your sine x by x. Okay, so how does this function look like? This kind of a function where you have sine of x by x is called a sinc function. Okay, it's called a sinc function. So you end up having something like this. Okay, so this is how it's going to look. It's equal in both directions. It should have been a little more better. Okay, so it's going to be very symmetric. Okay, this only happens when you have a symmetric square wave or a symmetric square pulse. It should be like this. So even the idea that it's just a square wave function is, it's not very correct. Okay, the options itself are kind of like wrong. It should have been a symmetric square wave. Okay, so now let's look at this a little bit more carefully. Okay, so what you're going to have to use here is, first you need to solve that problem for the square pulse. That's done in the 2013 paper. So you'll have to refer back there and solve that problem. After that, you need to use something called the duality property. Okay, so basically the duality property is like taking a Fourier transform of Fourier transform. So what you would have is this f of t. Okay, you take a Fourier transform of that, you get a capital F of omega. Now what you do is you replace the omega by t. You also replace this t divided as minus omega, and you end up getting this particular factor 2 pi here. Sometimes I think you might have written it as root of 2 pi, but the constant really doesn't matter, so we can ignore that part out. You have a 2 pi f of minus omega. Okay, so this is going from the time domain to the frequency domain, and you're replacing the terms. Okay, so you're replacing omega by t, you're replacing t by minus omega. Now I want to show you another way to write this Fourier transform. Okay, this is a space domain and wave number domain. Okay, or your wave vector domain. So the space domain is basically denoted as x, and you have a k here. Okay, so you replace k by x, you replace x by minus k, and you do this. Okay, so these are the two ways you can kind of like tell, okay, what do you mean by a Fourier transform? You're basically going from the time domain to the frequency domain, or you're going from the space domain to the wave number domain. Okay, and this property called the duality property needs to be used in order to solve this question. Okay, so if you recall, in your 2013 paper, what was given to you was this: what is the Fourier transform of a square function? and your option had sinc function in it. Okay, so what you need to do now is you need to find out the Fourier transform with sinc function. Now the easiest way to do this is to actually look at the Fourier transform with square function, okay, and take that and find the Fourier transform again. Okay, so you kind of like get back the square function. Okay, so this is like, instead of like working it out step by step, this is like a trick to remember it. Okay, so and also one important thing is that the square function is used heavily in a lot of electronic applications. So that's why they keep asking these questions over and over again. So you realize that the same thing was asked in the almost similar thing was asked in the 2013 paper. Again, you're ending up with the same thing asked in your 2014 paper. Okay, so very related concepts. Okay, so that part is a homework. Okay. Now let's look at this. An amplifier has a voltage gain of 500. Okay, so that means, let's say this is AV, and an input impedance of 20 kilo ohms without any feedback. Now a negative feedback with beta equal to 0.1 is applied. Its gain and input impedance with the feedback will respectively be what? Okay, so these are the answers that I've given to you. This is pretty simple. Okay, this must be something that you've done in your BSc, must have forgotten, but let's just review the formula anyway. Okay, so this is the gain with feedback, this is the gain without feedback, this is the feedback fraction beta v, which is already given in the question. So you have an AV divided by 1 plus AV into beta. You substitute that, you end up getting the gain with feedback. Next, what they've asked you for is the input impedance. How does the input impedance change when you give a feedback to the circuit? So with negative voltage feedback, the input impedance is increased and is given by Z in bar. Okay, so this is a new input impedance, okay, Z in prime, which is equal to 1 plus AV beta V into Zn. So you substitute your beta V here, you substitute your AV here, and you get a Zn. Okay, so you have 51 into 20 kilo ohms, and you calculate this, you end up getting a 120 kilo ohms. So what's in your option? So you've got a 9.8 and 120 kilo ohms. Now, just as, let's say next year they ask you about what is the output impedance. Okay, so what is the formula for your output impedance? Is basically Z out. Okay, so the initial output impedance that you had without your feedback divided by 1 plus AV beta V. What is beta V? Beta V is your feedback fraction. Okay, so this is your new output with feed Z out, or your impedance, output impedance with the feedback. This is again your output impedance without the wait, yeah, just a second. Yeah, okay. So this is Z out is basically the output impedance without the feedback, and Z out here, this with the prime, is basically the output impedance with the feedback. Okay, so if you, what here you have to do is multiply it. Here what you have to do is divide. Okay, so let's look at this. Now, this normal Zeeman effect is going to be, like, there are a lot of questions that are asked on normal Zeeman effect with respect to problems in your MSc. So this is a very good question for both cases, CASER as well as your MSc. So the normal Zeeman effect of cadmium, red line, is given by this. Okay, so this is the wavelength that is given to you. When the cadmium atoms are placed in a magnetic field of 0.09 Tesla, the shift is. So what is Zeeman effect basically? Zeeman effect is the, when you take, let's say when you take the material and you place it in a magnetic field, you're going to see spectral lines are split, right? So that shift needs to be calculated. And how do you calculate that shift? So let's look at this. So these are the different shifts that are given to you. So shift basically means the distance, right? So that's why you have a unit of distance here, your angstrom. Okay, so let's start off with this. E is equal to hc by lambda is what you know, or this is most, which is commonly used. E is equal to h nu. Okay, nu is equal to c by lambda. So E is equal to hc by lambda. Okay, so that is pretty trivial. Now let's look at this. What you need to do is you need to calculate the shift. Okay, so let's take a small elemental energy value. Let's take the small elemental wavelength. Okay, so dE is equal to minus hc, which is here. Now this, when you differentiate it, you have to be careful. You have a lambda power minus 1. So you have a minus into lambda power minus 2, and that's how you're going to be getting this. Now let's see what else you can do. So they've taken the modulus of this. Okay, we have to take the modulus of this because we just want the shift. They're not asking the direction of the shift or anything like that. They just want the shift. So you take the modulus of your dE and you also take the modulus of your d lambda. What do you want to calculate? You want to calculate the shift. So you put up your d lambda here and you have a lambda squared dE divided by h cross omega. Now, what is your dE basically? There's going to be a certain amount of energy that is required, and that required amount of energy is given by your magnetic field. Okay, so your dE Zman is equal to EH divided by 4 pi mB. So this is something that you will be deriving in your third semester. This formula is something that you'll be deriving, and also you'll be looking at the splitting of each, splitting of the spectral lines and looking at the shift of each. Okay, so you'll be doing this derivation in your coming up AMOP general lectures. So what do you have here? You have D is equal to delta E Zman, EH divided by 4 pi m into B. Okay, so now your EH, E is a constant, H is a constant, 4 pi m. M, you're supposed to be using the value of the electrons, right? Now what do you have here? You substitute this in your electron volt. Okay, if you remember the electron volt, otherwise you convert it into your electron volts, because electron volts is usually the energy that you denote for your all these atomic and microscopic kind of situations. Okay, so you have your dE calculated here. All you have to do is take this dE and substitute it here. Lambda value is already given in your question here. Okay, so they've kind of like given you the calcium red line here. So you have to just substitute that. Lambda squared dE divided by hc, and you end up getting the value of the shift. Okay, so first what are you supposed to do? Take the energy, take the derivative of the energy, take the modulus of that, related to the shift of it. Now you need to find out the energy required for the splitting. So what do? You kind of like have to look at, you have to derive this on your own later on again. So here you would have your delta Zman, which is equal to EH cross divided by 4 pi m, which is dependent on the magnetic field. And then finally you find out the splitting, the shift of the split lines. Okay, so this is a very simple question. Okay, so you can just do it intuitively. So you know that an electron always have a spin half. Okay, electron is called a spin half particle. It's a fermion. Okay, so now let's say what is the value of J for one electron? Okay, let's say it's plus half. Okay, now let us look at the options. Okay, so here in your 4f shell of an atom, there are 6 electrons. The value of your J is 0, 1, 2, 3. What is it? So let's draw the F shell. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and 7. Okay, so each of these can fill up 2 things, right? But you only have 6 electrons. So you have to fill it according to the Hund's rule of multiplicity. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6. Okay, so each of these has some kind of a half value. Into 3, into 6 should end up giving you the value of J for this entire system as 3. So it's pretty simple to kind of like do that. So let's just look at this. What is the basic rule? Okay, the Hund's rule of maximum multiplicity is used here. And I will tell you what multiplicity means later on. The rule states that for a given electronic configuration, the lowest energy term is the one with the greatest value of spin multiplicity. So this implies that if 2 or more orbitals of equal energy are available, electrons will occupy them singly before filling them up in pairs. So the total J value that you have here is half into 6, which is equal to 3. So what do you mean by multiplicity? Multiplicity is basically, you can also define the spin value, your total spin value for your angular momentum as S. Okay, so you have 2s plus 1. Or you can define it as the number of unpaired electrons plus 1. Okay, so that's your multiplicity. But that's not what we are looking at here. We're looking at the total value of J. So what do? You take the value of the J value of an electron, multiply it with the total number of electrons, and you end up getting the total value of J. Okay, so now we are up to the last question. So Paschen back effect. What is Paschen back effect? So basically it is, let's say it's like a sub of your Zeeman effect. Okay, so Zeeman effect is basically splitting of spectral lines under the presence of a magnetic field, and Paschen back effect is something to do with the amount of the magnetic field that you apply. So let's look at what it depends on. So the Paschen back effect is due to spin of the electron only orbital motion of the electron, spin orbit interaction, or spin of the nucleus. So what is Zeeman effect? It's the splitting of spectral lines under the presence of your magnetic field. What is Paschen back effect? So what happens is, based on the magnetic field that you apply. So if it's an external magnetic field, if the external magnetic field is large enough, it breaks the coupling between the spin and orbital angular momentum, and it gives you a different pattern because of the splitting, and this is called your Paschen back effect. So let's look at this back. What is it? Your Paschen back effect is basically due to your spin orbit interaction. If you do not have your spin orbit interaction, you wouldn't have something called your Paschen back effect. Okay, so yeah, that's the last question for today.